It is a fairly common occurrence that history is told, whether written or spoken, in an overly simplified way in order to save time. Edward I, for instance, is usually remembered as the king who hammered the Scots and crushed the Welsh, a brute of a king who you simply wouldn't want to cross. There are, of course, large elements of truth in that fairly basic analysis, but like most of medieval history, Edward's reign was more complex. Whilst Edward was unquestionably both feared and respected in his own time, there was also much discontentment during his reign. Whilst it is easy to focus our attention on Edward's various campaigns, the Scottish ones in particular, we also should acknowledge the social impact that Edward's wars had in England as well. In 1297, during his dispute with the French king Philip IV, Edward planned to lead a campaign in Flanders, but was met with open hostility. A song called The Song Against the King's Taxes, written during the reign of Edward's son Edward II, a song which also applied strongly to the younger Edward's expeditions, was critical of Edward I's Flemish campaign. It says, "A king ought not to go out of his kingdom to make war unless the commons of his land will consent. By treason we often see very many perish. No one can tell in whom to trust with certainty. Let not the king go out of his kingdom without counsel." The country, it seemed, was tired of Edward's wars. Having subdued the Welsh after a massive programme of castle building, which of course was hugely expensive, Edward was now in the midst of a dual war against the Scots and French, who, through the old alliance, were ganging up against the English king. Whilst Edward's war against the French was both understandable and probably justifiable, the Scottish war would have been far more antagonising for his subjects. Edward had meddled himself in Scottish affairs and would pass on something of a quagmire to his successor. Whilst Edward did his very best to quieten the spirited Scots, leading a far reaching campaign across Scotland in 1296, he never had the full control over England's northern neighbours in the way that he wanted. Indeed, on his death in 1307, Edward was once again travelling north to crush yet another Scottish revolt. Whilst Edward may have deemed his war necessary to subdue his enemies both in the north and across the Channel, it is certain that not everybody was of that same opinion. As Edward sought financial assistance for the Flemish campaign in 1297, there was discontent amongst both rich and poor alike. Money, it seemed, was pouring out of their pockets, and what was worse, the king then massively overstepped the mark. As well as levying taxes frequently, Edward then seized a huge amount of wool, a staple of the English economy, which infuriated the merchants. The nobles were now quite rightly up in arms against their king. Edward now had to do his level best to appease his barons. During the reign of his father, Henry III, Edward had seen at close hand the trouble powerful barons could cause, with Henry briefly deposed for a short time because of his dispute with the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. Keeping this in mind, Edward was now forced to reissue Magna Carta to avoid a similar fate. Edward, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine, to all those that these present letters shall hear or see, greeting. Know ye that we, to the honour of God and of Holy Church, and to the profit of all our realm, have granted for us and our heirs, that the Great Charter of Liberties and the Charter of the Forest, which were made by common assent of all the realm in the time of King Henry, our father, shall be kept in every point without breach. Despite the efforts that Edward went to appease his angry nobles, the Flemish campaign was ineffectual, and eventually Edward would make peace with the French, although the Scottish wars would rumble on. For all his undoubted military might, Edward I's kingship did have its fair share of problems, and not only with the anger at the king's all too frequent taxes. Another political song, called The song on the venality of the judges relays problems that were gripping English law during Edward's reign. It says, there are judges whom partiality and bribes seduce from justice. These are they, I remember well, that pay toll to the devil, and they serve him alone. Clearly corruption was rife, but it is doubtful that this was of any great concern to Edward I. An earlier king of England, Henry II, despised corruption in all its forms, and certainly would have been furious if his judges had been as corrupted as Edward's. But the priorities of Edward Longshanks were clearly on the battlefield. He was a warrior at heart, and it was that warrior nature that prevented England from falling into the same chaos that gripped the reign of Henry III. Edward was a fierce, powerful, and intimidating man who popularized the novel execution of hanged, drawn, and quartered. He was not a man you'd want to argue with unless you had considerable support and were very sure of yourself. After the death of Edward I at Buron Sands in the summer of 1307, the lament of the death of Edward I was written expressing sorrow for the old king's passing. It goes, Lords, listen for the sake of God the Great, a little song of grievous sorrow for the death of a precious king, a man he was of great goodness, and who, by his loyalty, has sustained many a great encounter. This thing is proved well. Of his land he lost none. Let us pray to God with true devotion that he pardons his sins. Of England he was lord, and a king who knew much of war. In no book can we read of a king who sustained better his land. All the things which he would do wisely, he brought them to an end. Now his body lies in the earth, and the world is going to ruin. Whilst I do think there were kings who did indeed better sustain England as a country than Edward I had done, nonetheless Longshanks remains one of the enduring names in English medieval history. When he died at the age of 68, you could be certain that there would have been many a sigh of relief amongst Edward's enemies, in particular north of the border. Meanwhile, England would find itself lumbered with Edward II, and well might England lament Edward I's death now.